Good afternoon, everyone. Lupo here once again. I've come across several documents that were sent to us for editing. I've discovered that there are similarities in terms of the challenges that are faced by scholars or students when writing their chapter 4, which we normally refer to it as findings or the discussion of findings, or in some institutions they will refer it as the interpretation and presentation of results, where you are presenting the results that you've got after analyzing your qualitative data. There are minor issues or minor things that we need to unpack in order for one to produce an acceptable chapter 4 that will give you the marks that you need. For example, in your chapter 4, obviously, you're going to give us an introduction on what to expect in that particular chapter. And then you start presenting the results. You could start, if it was a quantitative study, we'll talk about the response rate, but in this case, it's not necessary in a qualitative study. You start presenting your demographic or the demographic profile of your participants. There's two ways that we normally do this. If you were using a semi-structured interview guide, you will have to present this data in a in a graph format. But if you were using an open-ended interview guide, you will present this data in a discussion format. Okay, I want us to start with the semi-structured because it's a commonly used uh, instrument when conducting a qualitative study because it's less time consuming. Your demographic profile will consist of things like the age of your participants, level of education, length of service in the company if it's a company, uh, uh, things like their job title or division, uh, and so forth. Many things that you think will be necessary in your study. When you're presenting that data, you'll be using graphs or tables. It is very important that before you discuss or you label your figure, you must give an introductory statement of what this figure is all about. Then you present the figure. Underneath the figure, you provide a discussion. Once you've provided that discussion, it is advisable that the numbers presented underneath the figure, they must be the same as the numbers presented in the actual figure. Secondly, all the findings you've gathered in that figure, they must be confirmed using literature. Remember, one of the golden rules of chapter 4 is that you do not introduce new literature in that chapter. And secondly, once you have done that successfully, you then move into the discussion of your themes, sub-themes that you have achieved when you were coding your data. When you are discussing this and presenting these findings, it is very important that you use direct quotes. How do you select these direct quotes? You choose the main arguments that were made by your participants when answering these questions. Strong answers that mostly encompasses what had been said by other participants. Then you summarize what has been said by other participants that do not necessarily reflect on what has been said above. After you have done that, you need to go back to chapter 2, get the literature that supports your findings or your observations. For example, you've provided these direct quotes, then you say now in your confirmation of findings, these findings are similar to those discovered or made by so and so in this particular year. And then you state those findings. Remember, chapter 4 needs to ensure that every objective in your chapter 1 is being discussed explicitly. In some institutions, they don't want you to use literature to confirm your findings in chapter 4. They just want you to present your findings, meaning with your themes or your codes and consolidated codes, the themes or the sub-themes, and the direct quotes from the participants. It depends. Hence, it's very important that you get a template from your university, if there is any, or you ask your supervisor to give you a structure that he or she prefers when you are presenting the findings. Make it a point that your literature that you're using on chapter 4 is the same as the literature presented in chapter 2. So, hence, it's very important that when you're developing your chapter 2, you must make it a point that it covers every objective so that you do not struggle when you're working on your chapter 4. Hence, we in chapter 3 under trustworthiness, because remember, we said in chapter 3 that if it's a qualitative study, we do not look at validity and reliability rather than trustworthiness. So, under trustworthiness, there are elements such as transferability and confirmability. We transfer the data to confirm our findings. That's how we prove the trustworthiness of our findings. So in front of me are the various elements that needs to be considered when working on a qualitative study. So things like your credibility. How do you improve credibility? You understand? So those were discussed when we were talking about chapter 3. So what your participants have stated must be quoted when doing your chapter 4. Participant 1 stated that. Participant 2 disagrees with the statement above or agrees by highlighting this and this. Does that make sense? Or participant 4 added that. Then you state that as a direct quote, put that in inverted commas, so that whoever is reading your document is able to distinguish if these are your own words or words said by your participants during the process of conducting the interview. So make it a point that what is directly quoted must have inverted commas. In some instances, you are required to write that in italic format as an indication of that uh, this has been said, is being said by or was said by the participant. How you present your themes and subthemes or your codes and consolidated codes, you can use tables, you can use word clouds, you can use different ways of presenting that. But make it a point that whatever format you use, there is a clear distinction of the relationship between the themes and sub-themes. And all the discussion that you bring into this document, try by all means to pull yourself out of the study. This is not about you. Remember, in research, it is always advisable that we write objectively. We must not include ourselves in the study. So, you started with the demographic profile of the participants, you've discussed that, and then you've used the relevant literature to support your findings. That your study has discovered that, or the participants that participated in your study were 60% of them were females and 40% of them were males. How does that affect your study? How will that affect the results of the study? It is very important. You go further to say, let's say you're looking at the length of service of the participants. Remember, you are using a semi-structured interview guide, so meaning which a certain part of it is structured and a certain part of it is unstructured. So how do you go about doing this? For example, let's say you're looking at the length of service as one of the demographic information provided by the participants. 10% of your participants had more than 15 to 20 years of experience. 90% of them, they have less than 3 or 5 years of experience. How they interpret and engage with the questions will totally be different based on their level of experience. How does that then affect your study, or what impact will that have in your study? You need to clearly indicate that based on the level of experience of the majority of participants, some of the questions that requires managerial experience or certain level of experience, they were not able to adequately discuss. Now the reader understands that, okay, some of these questions were at the management level. Hence, these participants seems to be struggling to articulate them properly. It's because they lacked the level of experience within this organization or in general. So let the reader be able to grasp that from your discussion. I think I'm trying to explain this in an easy way, so that you can use this video when you are working on your chapter 4 to develop a well-written document. So one might ask, how do you develop your themes? A theme must capture something important in your data in relation to the research question. It must be something that captures one of the most important things in your data in relation to the research questions. It must represent some level of patterned response or meaning within the data. Patterned response. This thing must appear more frequently. There must be a pattern here that will give you a theme. But I'm not here to discuss that. We'll discuss that when we're cleaning and analyzing data in more detail. But now I'm just talking about the development of chapter 4. Provide an introduction, a demographic profile of the participants, what was included and what was excluded and why it was included. Then you start presenting your data. And I said, if you are using a semi-structured interview guide, let's say the demographic profile or demographic information of the respondents was captured using structured questions. Even when analyzing and presenting the data, it must reflect that. Meaning which you will use tables and graphs, your pie chart, and so forth to present your demographic information. Unless you use unstructured questions when you're capturing when you're capturing the demographic information of your participants, then that must be presented in a discussion format. No tables involved, no graphs involved. But if it was in a structured format, even on the data collection instrument, that needs to reflect on your chapter 4 as well. So let me stop there for today. We'll carry on later on in the week. Don't forget to send me questions on my inbox of issues that you want us to discuss or issues that you want me to unpack in my videos, so that I do not discuss unnecessary things, but I must provide a content that will be helpful in when you are working on your research. Thank you very much.